Thank you very much. So, I'm the only thing that stands between you and a cocktail, and I'm dressed. I'm really sorry. The Naked Environmentalist actually is about talking about the deep issues, the reasons why we consume. So I thought it was very interesting, the comment from the front here about what's been driving this consumption, what's been driving this resource, and that we were discussing governance and governments. And I want to discuss you, people, human beings, the 7 billion to 9 billion of us that we're going to have, and why is it that we consume? And crucially, why is it that we overconsume? So, I'm here to talk about sex, and I'm a little bit nervous because standing in front of a room and talking about sex, however relevant it is to the issue, is not something that human beings are terribly comfortable about. And so I'd like you to help me out, because I'm going to be talking about sex and also about social media. So let's ask the easiest question first. Who in here uses social media? Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest. Brilliant. Okay. And secondly, who in this room has sex? Brilliant. Okay, look around the room, look at the hands that are up. Be aware that this is something that's human, this is something that's normal. So hopefully I can get over my anxiety and actually talk to you a little bit more naturally. So being as I'm here to talk about social media, this is my Twitter name, this is my company, this is the hashtag for where we are. Futerra is 13 years old this year. We work with major multinational brands. We work with governments, including the US, UK, and also African governments. We work with the NGOs. I sit on Greenpeace's communication group, on Friends of the Earth communication group. We rebrand people like Fair Trade and also big brands. And I work for sustainable development, but I also work in the marketing, communications, and advertising industry. And I'm here to talk to you, in part, about the marketing, communications, and advertising industry. Because if you're going to talk about resource consumption, and especially if you're going to talk about conspicuous consumption, then we're talking about my people. So, sex and social media. The first part of what I'm going to speak to you about is about sex. And the second part is about social media. And I'm really going to try to make the second part as interesting as the first part. Because we spend a lot of time talking about what's wrong at the moment. What's wrong with our communications. What's wrong with our resource consumption. Why we are totally screwed if we keep consuming the way we're consuming. By the way, that totally screwed comment was the first of my little English puns on sex and sustainability. But not very many people have the guts to suggest what an alternative might be, rather than going back 50 years, 100 years, 150 years. So I'm going to try to suggest what an alternative to our levels of conspicuous consumption are that would work within the way in which human beings are programmed. So, first of all, a little bit of a lesson on sex. You have your primary sexual characteristics, and those are your gender. And they're primarily what's going on in here somewhere. You have your secondary sexual characteristics. Those are boobs, breasts, how soft or hard your skin is, how your musculature works. Basically, the way that I know what gender you are by looking at you. I can't look inside, I can't see whether you've got ovaries, what your gonads are like, but I can look at you and I can make an assumption about your gender from your second sexual characteristics. But human beings are far more complicated than that. And we've developed tertiary sexual characteristics. For almost every other species on the planet, it's the secondary or even the primary sexual characteristics that count in breeding. For human beings, it's the tertiary ones. Wealth, knowledge, goods, skills, tribes, our accent, our facial scarification, who our parents tell us we can marry. We've developed all of these incredibly complex rules of mating, and we've built them into our endocrine system. So our endocrine system, the way in which we hormonally respond to each other, are as much based on these tertiary signals as they are on our secondary ones. One of the reasons for that is that women, human women, and the female great apes are the only mammals that don't experience estrus. For every woman in the room, estrus, every other mammal gets this, is when females go occasionally into heat. It's the only time where they can actually fall pregnant, is during estrus. They get very horny, and then they get over it. Women, human women, are menstrual. We don't have estrus, which means that we are actually sexually receptive all the time. We can fall pregnant at any time, not just during periods of heat. That means that we are on the hamster wheel of sexual selection constantly. There's no downtime. There's no time when we can step out of sexual selection. And one of the outcomes of this is that human civilization has been built on constant status selection because of the constant ability to mate, the constant ability to breed. How you're dressed, how you speak, what clothes you're wearing, how you interact with each other are based on social rules. And a huge number of those social rules are based on mating protocols, on who is allowed to have sex with who, on who is allowed to breed with who. Now, in many cultures throughout history, and indeed in cultures around the world, those rules are pretty clear. There's caste systems and rituals and hierarchies around who is allowed to mate with who. In Western capitalist democracy, we have primarily based our status hierarchy, not on what caste you were born into, but on how much material goods you have gathered. How much material wealth you have gathered is the basis of a lot of our status selection. So, I'm here talking about conspicuous consumption. The huge, monumental amount of conspicuous consumption that in developed economies we consume, the vast amount of resources we consume in order to signify our status to others. And by the way, depending on which numbers you look at, America's second or third largest export is its entertainment industry, its movies, its TV programs, its music, which is exporting the idea of sexual selection through goods accumulation to the rest of the world, where your position in the hierarchy depends on how much you have. So this is crucially important. And it started a long time ago. In 1929, a group of young women, young attractive women, walked in the Easter parade in New York City. And if you look at her right hand, you'll notice that she's holding a cigarette. In 1929, women smoking was absolutely taboo. It's incredibly low status. By getting a group of young, fertile, well-dressed women to walk in the Easter parade with, in their own words, their torches of freedom, of female empowerment, a huge national conversation was begun about smoking being one of the last taboos for women, and a massive pushback. It's very, very clever marketing. And it was devised by a chap called Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew and was working for the American Tobacco Organization. From the very earliest days of psychology and psychiatry, as the first insights into how our brains work were being laid down, the advertisers were already beginning to use that in order to signify what is hot and what's not. The use of sex in advertising continued on apace. This is an advert for Listerine, where the poor young girl, always the bridesmaid, never the bride because she has terrible bad breath, was a fundamental way that Listerine managed to remarket itself from being an anti-Dandruff shampoo to being an anti-bad breath mouthwash. By the way, they didn't change the formula at all. It just went from being a shampoo to being a mouthwash through playing on people's fears of the sexual hierarchy. By the way, the advert might have changed, the product's still the same, and the key message is still the same today. Sexual selection, status hierarchy in advertising. We see it in iconic Fly Me adverts, which, by the way, haven't changed that much through to today. I had to use this one because it's the only picture of a naked man I could find in all of the sexual adverts. We are wading through a huge communications atmosphere that is based on making us feel that we have to consume in order to perform in the sexual hierarchy. And just in case you're sitting there thinking, but I've found the love of my life, I've stepped out of that, I'm afraid that you haven't. The roller coaster, the hamster wheel, status hierarchy continues on whatever circumstances in life you're in. When two white, middle-aged, straight men walk into a room and try to work out who is the highest status, they're part of sexual selection. We don't turn it off. Sometimes it's relatively obvious. This advert on the right is an advert for the Mercedes S-Class that comes with 8, count them, 8 airbags. You can even sell consumption through status consumption. Sex is prevalent in a huge percentage of our marketing and advertising because it's playing into this very deep need for us to signal the fact that we are accumulating wealth. Nobody goes shopping for clothes to make them a better parent. Nobody buys a Ferrari in order to be smarter. If you put a man in a Ferrari and take a blood test before he gets in the Ferrari and takes a blood test after he's driven the Ferrari, there is a measurable increase in his testosterone. But only if he was observed whilst he was driving. So we're not fighting just against politics here, just against governance. In order to deeply affect resource consumption, we're fighting against the endocrine system. There's not a message about please be more resource efficient because we're burning up the planet's goods that's going to work against testosterone. We either have to reprogram human beings, or we have to find a better way for people to demonstrate their sexual selection. So we either are going to step out of the sexual competition rat race, which when you think through human history, from foot binding to facial scarification to the Victorians putting 4-year-old children into corsets, you don't find many places in the world or places in history where sexual competition doesn't matter. It's very difficult to step out of this. So if we're not going to step out of it, we're going to have to find something to replace it with. Because it's honest signaling. Huge numbers of animals do honest signaling. Honest signaling, Darwin worked it out, was how you are incredibly wasteful to show how good breeder material you are. You grow incredibly wasteful, long, easy to catch, easy to see tail feathers to show that if I am this wasteful, think what a good provider I must be. Conspicuous consumption is supposed to be wasteful. That's the point. It's supposed to be wasteful. And so, we have got to try to move away from a way of demonstrating our sexual hierarchy through honest signalling and to another way of defining status. Sex, status equals consumption. They're the bedrocks of overconsumption. They're the bedrocks of bling. So what I'm here to suggest to you, this is the second half, there's going to be less photographs of boobs, is that perhaps we could have a liberal communications democracy rather than a liberal capitalist democracy, where rather than defining our status through what we own, we could define it in a different way. Now, many of you would really hope that I'm about to talk about the fact that we could define status through who we are, through what we've achieved, through our spiritual approach, through what we do in our communities. I'm not absolutely sure that one's going to work. Because mating is red in tooth and claw. It's not nice, it's not kind, it's not equal, and it's sure as hell not fair. We have to find a replacement for conspicuous consumption that is as desirable as conspicuous consumption is, and is as desirable quickly. We don't have time to reprogram human beings. We do have time to change status signals. In fact, they're already beginning to change. Around the world, social media has got more take-up than toilets. Social media has more take-up than democracy. More human beings are connecting with each other and beginning to define status through social media than through consumption. Primarily because in most places in the world, overconsumption, I mean, at least for half of our fellow human beings, overconsumption is not now and will never be an option. Disney is lying to them. They cannot compete sexually through the amount of goods and wealth they consume because there simply isn't going to be enough. It's been a Ponzi scheme. In Europe and North America, perhaps we can still compete on how much we've got for a little while. That's not going to be possible for the rest of the world. So social media begins to give away where we can have sexual selection with radically reduced resource consumption. 10% of the world population's on Facebook. That makes it the largest community of human beings after China and India. 2 billion more people are going online in the next 5 years. I could give a lot more statistics, but you have to be really careful because every minute that you give statistics, they begin to go out of date because so many more people are getting online and are getting part of social media. As I said, more people are online and have a mobile phone than have a toilet. And there's a huge group, a huge percentage of our fellow human beings, the millennials, those under 30, who are growing up in an environment where a like can have more value than a thing. Where an intangible like from a friend, from a stranger, can matter more than a pair of trainers or an outfit. Think for a moment what that might mean when you extrapolate up from if conspicuous consumption could move into status signaling online, the number of likes you get mattering more than the amount of stuff you have, what that would mean for our resource infrastructure. What that would mean for our cars, our holidays, our food, our clothes, the size of our homes, the amount of products we buy and dispose of, for our throwaway culture. If even 50% of our status signaling moved online, if 70% of it did, what would that mean for our energy infrastructure? Digital communications, the digital economy, works much better with a decentralized community energy. I've visited many places in the world that are getting online through renewables. One of the primary reasons why people are investing is so that they can power their mobile phones. Now, the digital economy uses anywhere between 2 to 10% of our carbon, depending on who you listen to. There are ways to make that much more resource efficient. There are ways to make that renewable. But personally, I believe that if we could move a significant amount of our sexual status signaling online and stop buying stuff, then the digital economy can be welcome to all the energy it wants. It's already beginning to happen. There are already beginning to be ways for us to signal our status online. How many endorsements you have on LinkedIn, what your clout score is, how many likes on Facebook, how many pokes, how many shares. Beginning to be ways in which status, online status, can begin to be compared. Because by the way, it has to be comparable. You have to be able to compare yourself to somebody else in order for it to be useful for status signaling. Remember, status signaling isn't very nice. It's a way for us to compare each other and to choose mates. It needs to be red in tooth and claw. Beginning to be red in tooth and claw. One of my good friends, Rebecca, works with at-risk youth. And we did a very interesting survey asking them what their priorities were, what they would give up. Would they exchange their trainers for access to school? Would they exchange McDonald's for a handbag? What were their hierarchies? Would they choose to move away from home versus giving up social media? Turned out that social media trumped every single other part of their life, including family. Mostly they're teenagers and at-risk teenagers. But every single thing they owned or could own, they put social media above. Interestingly, AXA, one of the largest insurers in the world, also surveyed people about what they care about most and what they would like to protect most in their home. Is it their car? Is it their photographs? What is it that would be the most difficult for them to live without? You know what their number one? The number one was their broadband. It trumped the car. It trumped the washing machine. It trumped the house itself in terms of things which people would least like to give up. We're beginning to see this transition. Now, it's a very, very weak signal. It's a very weak signal. At the moment, people are still competing online using photographs of them buying stuff. We're just beginning to get that. And to be perfectly honest, anyone over 30 is going to have difficulty transitioning, because during your puberty years, when you laid down the definition of hierarchy, of sexual hierarchy, it was about goods. I'm thinking about the under 30s here, the under 20s, the under 10s, who have yet to go through puberty and have yet to define and decide what high status and low status is. Now, the Royal Society said that we actually have adequate resources to feed and clothe and provide for a planet of 9 billion. But not whilst 10% of humanity is absolutely out-consuming the other 90%, and whilst a huge percentage of that is being driven by status signaling. Can likes and unlikes replace cars and clothes? Can who you are online, inventive, smart, tribal, funny, responsive, zeitgeist-making, confrontational, become more important than what you own or how you look. Now, there's only one way that can work, and that's if our online status and our endocrine system begin to merge. At the moment, in order to know what your online status is, I need to know what your online name is and go and look you up. It doesn't really work with how human biology works. I have to be able to look at you and a little number or a little shape pop up above your head in order for me to work out whether I fancy you or not. With Google Glasses and with other wearable technology, it could become possible for a teenager to check out another teenager's social status rather than checking out his car or what he's wearing on his feet. For us to stand a little bit taller, for us to bring a blush to our face, for our physiology to begin to respond to our social status. And if that happens, if our physiology can begin to respond to our online status, if it can become more important than what somebody owns, then we could begin to see a transition to a liberal communications democracy. Right now, we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. It's part of the core problem of sustainable development and resource consumption. Could we begin to replace this from this? Now, the virtual world doesn't have to become about sustainable development. Social media doesn't have to start caring about resource consumption. It just has to keep doing what it's doing already, which is becoming a more perfect way for human beings to judge each other as potential mates, to judge each other's place in the social hierarchy, to judge each other's status. Now, a whole load of other things come along with that. The criteria by which your social status is set could become more interesting than it is now. I'm not even going to begin to promise that. It probably will stay down and dirty and silly and cruel, just like all sexual selection is. This is Grace. She's 4 years old and she's my very best friend. She's my niece. In 2050, she's going to be the same age that I am now. When I was her age, the internet was invented. She's got a nice little continuance of ages there. By 2050, if Grace is living in a world where the aspirational lifestyle and sexual signaling is still based upon how much you consume, on the honest signaling of resource waste, then we're screwed. If, when Grace is my age, we have managed to transition our status signaling into another environment, then we might make it. But that only gives us a very few years, because she is going to begin to start laying down what her aspirational lifestyle is very soon. Right now, a mobile phone is pretty aspirational, but so is a toy car. So we have a very short period of time to decide in which route we're going to go down. Globally, status through stuff or status through likes. I put forward the liberal communications democracy as a resource alternative to what we're facing now. I know it's not governance. I know that it's not targets. I know that it's not circular economy. But it could be a way to get to the root of who human beings are. So I'm finally going to say, please talk about sex more. Please think about some of the deeper drivers of human beings are. And please keep the planet going long enough for us to make this transition. Thank you very much. I think we might have time for 1 or 2 questions or comments. There's one at the back there. Chap over here? Okay, someone else is coming. And by the way, that was the first time I've made that speech, and I was really nervous. So thank you for clapping. I've got to do a TEDx talk on it.
Thank you very much for what was, in my view, the most inspirational talk of the conference so far. My name is Coco Rocha. I'm a research fellow at Chatham House. My question is, I follow your thought, but the question that I have is, isn't what we see at the moment that the social media and the consuming economy and the sexuality behind that reinforces each other? That we see a world where if I have those trainers and I snap a picture of it and I put it on Twitter or on Facebook, that's when I get the likes. So it's just another means to communicate the same type of sexual hierarchy that you have described before.
Yeah. Yes, and I would say absolutely for the over 30s. For any of us who laid down in puberty our definition of what high status was as being goods, we are simply going to use social media as another mechanism to demonstrate that. It's only for the under 30s where it's possible to get likes from a selfie, where it's possible to get likes from a quote, where it's possible to get likes from being amusing, controversial, from being angry, from being funny, from being smart. Only in those groups would it be possible for a whole generation, a global generation, by the way, to realize that they can compete status competition without stuff. And at the moment, one of the reasons why that's possible is because a huge percentage of those who are going online with very little other material consumption. We know that by the time Grace is my age, we will not have as much access to stuff. Grace, however, lives in Brighton in the UK. She could compete on stuff during her puberty. In other places in the world, that's simply not going to be an option. So personally, I would like to think that this might even be inevitable rather than desirable, because a whole group of preteens need to compete, and there simply isn't going to be enough stuff for them to do so with through capitalist democracy. So yes, over 30s pretty much already laid down what they respond to. Under 30s, chance for that to change. Although very weak signal. Yes, question?
Yeah, my name is Christian Hagen.
Oh, so could you bring the microphone up? And can you bring the house lights up as well, please?
Indeed, very inspirational talk. My first remark would be in the same direction as I just heard. So I think there is an interrelation between the likes you get today and also the material stuff you have. If I look at my 15-year-old daughter, she is very active in social media, but she is also very active in shopping, although the education has been different. Yeah. But the second point from my point of view, I'm not so sure if looking at your future with the Google the Google glasses, if we are not exchanging the bad for the evil or the other way around. Because, I mean, with all these social media and think about security of personal data, think about NSA and all these things. So I think we have to be a bit careful when we say, okay, this is a future to get dematerialized, but maybe we are going into some other challenges there.
So that's a really interesting point. The only thing I'm talking about here is conspicuous consumption, the resource implication of conspicuous consumption, and status signaling. There's a whole load of other stuff. We could potentially be exchanging one set of problems for another equal set of problems. Or are they quite equal? Because to be blunt about it, the current set of problems that we have with resource consumption, with climate change, etc., are a zero-sum game. There is a clock that is ticking on them, which we deal with or we don't. The other set of problems, and we're human beings, so it's not like we're not going to have a set of problems. The other set of problems, challenging as they are, don't seem to me to put a 2050 zero time on them. Again, that's quite a hard argument to make. That's quite a difficult argument to make. To say, I would better the devil you know at the moment is really not the case. The devil we know is part per million 350 CO2 in the atmosphere. That is not a maintainable system. This possibly could be. NSA notwithstanding, massive transformational, Google glasses, huge inequity between the haves and have-nots, possibly quite a significant shift in generations. Because if you've got a generation here whose vested interest is material consumption, and a generation here whose vested interest is the virtual economy, those two economies could also come into conflict. Does this make sense? So you could even have generational conflict between those who prize the virtual world over the material one, and the huge percentage of those people who are not in this room who prize the material one and whose entire livelihood is based on it. So yes, a lot of challenges, but at heart, the only thing I'm suggesting here is, could we move conspicuous consumption away from material and into virtual? Other points? Come on here. Yes.
Yes, I'm Halina Brown. I agree with you, your basic message about competition, sex, mate. But since the competition is always about relative to the other person, other guy, other woman, we could do exactly the same thing you are describing, but on a 100th or 1,000th of a scale that we're doing right now, right? People who lived in caves, I'm sure, were competing, and one had a better stone tool than the other, right? So, but there is another issue here, and that is this whole system, the whole economic system in which we live, depends on us doing it not on a 1,000th of a scale, but on 1,000 times greater scale. So what I want to say is, it's more complicated than that.
Hugely.
It's not just an individual choice that people have, but there is a whole damn system that's going to do its darnest to keep it going in that direction, not in that direction.
So I couldn't agree with you more. One thing is absolutely, human beings will compete on consumption however much stuff there is available. In fact, one of the ways that you know if you've found a hominid, whether you're looking at Homo erectus, is whether there is, or Neanderthalis, is whether there's beads in a grave. Stuff has always mattered to us. The challenge being is that I can't imagine us transitioning to consuming a lot less stuff if stuff is still available by choice. I can imagine it happening by necessity, there just being a huge resource crunch and us going back to that way of doing it. I'm trying to put forward an idea that would allow us to transition within one generation, fundamentally within a planetary boundaries timescale. Your other point is crucial. So I got a couple of emails from some economists when I put this forward, and one of them essentially said, thank you, you have literally just wiped away the global economic system. It's like our entire system, our entire economy, our capitalist democracy is based upon material consumption. How on earth are people going to get paid? How are they going to eat? How are they going to trade in this environment? To which I turned around and said, you're the economist. You tell me. If this is already beginning to happen, if there are weak signals that there is a generation for whom online status matters more than stuff, then what we should be actively doing right now is trying to work out an economic system that supports that and that enables basic consumption, food, energy, etc., to still be produced viably within that system. I'm not an economist, I'm a communicator. I can see these weak signals. I would love to hear someone put forward an economic system whereby our material consumption has slashed fundamentally, but we are still competing online. How do you build a competitive economy based on that? So thank you for the question, but I would like it to be less a question to me and more a question to those who have expertise in that area. we could have a session on that.
So,
I think we may have to finish.
Thank you very much, Solitaire. One big hand and once more.